Tomorrow at 6:37 a.m., the world will end. There will be no sirens, no last news broadcast, no time for goodbyes. Just absolute silence and a question that will cut like a knife. What did you do with all those days? It's strange how this image immediately sends a chill down your spine. Not because of the fear of death itself, but because of something much more disturbing. The sudden clarity of how many things were left undone. How many conversations were postponed. How many hugs were avoided. How many opportunities slipped through our fingers while waiting for the right moment that never came. There is a silent pain that dwells in the hearts of those who live as if time were infinite. It is the anguish of realizing that an entire life has been built on the fragile foundation of later. Later I'll call, later I'll travel, later I'll tell the truth, later I'll start living for real. But later is a cruel illusion that turns days into a waiting room for an appointment that may never be made. Martin Heidegger called this flight from finitude, this human tendency to live as if death were a distant event that only happens to others. But when you look closely, you realize that it is not death that haunts us. It is the possibility of discovering, too late, that we have spent our entire lives rehearsing for a show that was already happening. The cruelest thing is how this realization always comes at the most unexpected moments. In the middle of an unimportant meeting, while endlessly scrolling through social media, or in that moment between sleep and wakefulness when the mind has not yet raised its usual defenses. Suddenly, a clear and painful awareness bursts in. My life is passing me by and I didn't even notice. That's when panic disguised as haste sets in. The desperate rush to make up for lost time. The feverish plans, the empty promises that, from now on it will be different. But soon the veil of routine descends again. The urgency dissipates, and everything returns to the same existential drowsiness as before. What hurts the most is not imagining the end of the world. What truly breaks you is recognizing how many days have been lost to distractions, how many real connections have been exchanged for notifications, how many dreams have been filed away in mental folders labeled "when I have time." Death does not kill. It only reveals what was already dead inside. There is an uncomfortable truth about the modern human condition that few have the courage to admit. We live anesthetized by the illusion of permanence, wasting the only asset that cannot be recovered, replaced, or traded. And when that anesthesia wears off, all that remains is the painful echo of a question that refuses to be silenced. If everything ended now, would it have been worth it? There is a specific type of blindness that affects almost all of humanity. It is not the loss of physical sight, but something much more subtle and devastating. The inability to see one's own mortality while alive. It is as if there were an invisible veil between the mind and the most obvious reality in the world, that all of this will end. This blindness is not accidental. It is cultivated, nurtured, protected like a precious treasure. Because facing death head-on, recognizing its constant presence, would require a complete revolution in the way we exist. It would require abandoning comforting distractions, grandiose plans for an uncertain future, elaborate justifications for not acting today. Heidegger observed with surgical precision how human beings develop an almost pathological resistance to the awareness of their own finitude. He called this the decay of being there, a state in which one lives completely absorbed by trivial daily life, superficial chatter, empty curiosity that never delves into anything truly essential. It is fascinating how this works in practice. Observe anyone on an ordinary day. They wake up already caught in a web of minor concerns. The meeting they need to prepare for, the bill that is due, the argument in traffic, the series they must finish watching. Each of these small urgencies builds a wall against the only real urgency. That time is running out second by second irreversibly. The illusion of permanence manifests itself in the most mundane things. We buy products with a 5-year warranty as if we were sure we would be here to use them. We make plans for retirement in our early 20s. We postpone reconciliation with a loved one because there will always be another opportunity, as if tomorrow were a given, not a fragile possibility that could crumble at any moment. But perhaps the most perverse thing is how modern society itself feeds this illusion. Social media creates an artificial sense of eternity. Photos that remain, messages that stay, a digital memory that simulates immortality. Obsessive planning for the future, the culture of productivity, the pressure to always have the next goal. Everything conspires to keep our eyes fixed on the horizon, never on the ground beneath our feet. The market capitalizes on this denial of death. It sells eternal youth, promises of longevity, insurance that protects against everything except the inevitable. Language itself contorts to avoid the word death. We talk about leaving, resting, leaving us, as if softening the vocabulary could postpone reality. And there is something even more insidious, the way work is used as existential anesthesia. A busy schedule becomes a shield against deep reflection. I don't have time to think about it, they say, as if being busy were synonymous with being alive. But what is this rush if not a desperate escape from the only question that really matters? There is a revealing phenomenon that occurs during personal or collective crises, when the illusory security of everyday life is shaken. An unexpected illness, the loss of a job, a pandemic. Suddenly the mask of permanence falls away. It is in these moments that one realizes how much life was being lived on autopilot, how many important decisions were being pushed to a later that may never come. What is most frightening is not death itself, but the sudden awakening to one's own absence of life. It is realizing that one has spent years, perhaps decades, functioning like a well-adjusted automaton, complying with social protocols, following empty routines, systematically postponing everything that could bring real meaning to existence. There is a curious phenomenon that occurs in hospitals. Nurses report that people on the verge of death often express the same kind of regret, not having lived a more authentic life, not having had the courage to express their feelings, having worked too hard, having lost touch with friends, not having allowed themselves to be happier. It is revealing how the real proximity of death instantly dispels all carefully constructed illusions. But why does this lucidity only come at the end? Why does one have to be literally dying to realize that one has never truly lived? The answer lies in the psychological architecture of denial. It is more comfortable to believe that there is infinite time than to face the responsibility of living each moment intensely. Heidegger called this being towards death. Not a morbid obsession, but the only authentic way to exist. When you truly accept that life has an expiration date, when you internalize that each day could be your last, something fundamental changes. Priorities reorganize themselves. The superficial loses its power. The essential gains urgency. There is something almost tragic in realizing how much energy is spent avoiding the only reflection that could give meaning to everything. What if there were no tomorrow? Not as a morbid exercise, but as an invitation to lucidity. Because when you remove the crutch of infinite time, when you cut the thread of the illusion of permanence, something extraordinary happens. Gestures gain weight, words acquire urgency, silences become eloquent. The real tragedy is not that life is short, it is that we live as if it were eternal. And when imaginary eternity collides with real finitude, all that remains is the echo of a question that cuts like glass. How many days were wasted waiting for life to really begin? There is a type of ghost that haunts the living. It is not the dead who return to visit us. It is the versions of ourselves that never came to be. These shadows inhabit the corners of our consciousness, whispering about paths not taken, words not spoken, hugs that remain suspended in the air. True terror does not lie in death, but in wasted life. It is the suffocating feeling of carrying a private cemetery inside your chest, where all the me's that could have been are buried. The brave young man who had audacious plans. The loving person who knew how to show affection without embarrassment. The dreamer who believed that anything was possible. Each of them died slowly, suffocated by routine, by fear, by the rush to appear adult and responsible. There is a specific cruelty in the way regret accumulates. It is not a weight that arrives all at once. It is a slow, almost imperceptible sedimentation. A no here, a later there, a well-crafted excuse over there. Each small surrender seems harmless at the time, but together they form a dense mass that lodges in the chest, becoming more difficult to carry with each passing year. Kierkegaard wrote about this with painful precision. Life can only be understood by looking backward, but it must be lived by looking forward. It is in this paradox that human suffering resides. You only see the value of what you have lost when there is no way to recover it. You only understand the importance of a moment after it has become a memory. The most devastating thing is to realize how much energy is wasted defending choices that deep down were never really choices. How many times have you said "I can't" when you really meant "I'm afraid"? How many opportunities have been turned down under the pretext of prudence, when what really drove you was the fear of failure, of exposing yourself, of discovering that perhaps you were not as special as you would like to believe? There is an archaeology of pain that only reveals itself in moments of absolute silence. It is when the mind stops defending itself that the most uncomfortable memories begin to emerge. That conversation that never happened, that project that was shelved, that person who was lost through pride or negligence. Each memory is a precise cut in the illusion that there were always good reasons not to act. And perhaps you recognize something familiar in these words, feeling that familiar pressure in your chest. It is no coincidence. It is the sound of your own soul trying to awaken you to something you have known for a long time, but prefer to keep hidden in the deepest layers of your consciousness. What hurts the most is not having failed at something. It is not even having tried. Failure, as painful as it may be, still carries within it the dignity of effort. But omission. Omission is a poison that spreads slowly, contaminating self-esteem for decades. It is impossible to respect yourself completely when you know, in the silence of the early morning, that you were a coward when you should have been brave. Modern society has created a perfect system for validating cowardice. It's called being responsible, thinking about the future, keeping your feet on the ground. These are elegant euphemisms for the fear of living intensely. How many times have you heard someone say that dreaming too much is dangerous, as if the alternative, accepting a diminished existence, were safer than betting on one's own potential? There is a perverse mathematics of regret. The more time passes, the greater the distance between who you are and who you could have been. And that is where one of the most subtle pains of the human condition is born: nostalgia for a future that never happened. It is not longing for the past. It is mourning for what the present could have been if the choices had been different. People often fear rejection, judgment, public failure. But these fears are almost childish compared to the true horror of reaching the end of life and discovering that you have been a stranger to yourself, that you have spent decades playing a role, meeting the expectations of others, building an acceptable version of yourself that never corresponded to what pulsed inside. The most ironic thing is how you build an entire identity around your own limitations. I'm not the kind of person who, that's not for me. I've always been this way. Each of these phrases is a self-imposed prison, a sophisticated way of giving up before even trying. It is more comfortable to believe in fixed limitations than to take on the frightening responsibility of being free. Heidegger spoke of the call of conscience, that inner voice that bursts forth in moments of greatest vulnerability, reminding us that authenticity is possible, a way of being that does not depend on external approval. But most people prefer to stifle that voice, because listening to it would mean admitting that much of what they have built so far is nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance. The tragedy is not in making mistakes. It is in never having had enough courage to truly make mistakes. Because those who have never failed spectacularly have probably never taken significant risks. And a life without significant risks is a life that slips away without leaving a mark, like water running off a smooth surface. There is a thought experiment proposed by Nietzsche that acts as a relentless mirror for the human soul. Imagine that a demon appears and declares that the life you live today, with all its repetitions, frustrations, small pleasures, and great voids, will have to be lived exactly the same way, over and over again. Every word spoken, every missed opportunity, every moment of boredom, every episode of cowardice, everything repeating itself eternally, with no possibility of change or redemption. The first reaction is almost always one of horror. Not because of the intense pain, that at least has weight, has meaning. The horror comes from the idea of endlessly repeating mediocrity, Sundays wasted aimlessly surfing the internet, empty conversations about the weather, TV series watched without real involvement just to fill the inner silence. The prospect of reliving this existential lethargy forever is more terrifying than any religious hell. Nietzsche did not create this provocation out of intellectual sadism. The eternal return is a brutal existential test. It serves to reveal who is truly alive and who is just taking up space in the world. Who could embrace the idea of repeating everything endlessly? Only those who live with such intensity and authenticity that each moment carries the weight of eternity. But the reality is bleaker. Most people are living lives they couldn't bear to repeat even once, let alone infinitely. They are stuck in routines that drain their vital energy, relationships that are sustained by inertia, jobs that inspire no passion whatsoever. And the cruelest thing is that they know this but refuse to admit it because admission would require a complete revolution. It is fascinating how a growing tolerance for one's own dissatisfaction develops, like a person who has lived for years in a house with a leaky roof and stops noticing the leak. At first, each drop is annoying, arouses irritation, and generates the impulse to solve the problem. Over time, the noise becomes familiar, almost comforting. What was intolerable becomes the background of existence. This adaptation to mediocrity is one of the most sophisticated forms of slow suicide that humans have developed. It is not dramatic like conventional methods. It leaves no body, causes no commotion, does not brutally interrupt the family narrative. It is a death by small cuts in the soul, a gradual erosion of vitality that goes unnoticed even by those closest to us. The most perverse thing is how we learn to call this resignation maturity, as if accepting the unacceptable were a sign of personal growth, as if giving up on dreams were an achievement of wisdom. I was young and idealistic, they say, with a melancholic smile that tries to disguise the bitterness of having betrayed their own hope. Modern culture has created an entire vocabulary to romanticize giving up, being realistic, having your feet on the ground, thinking with a cool head. These are all elegant ways of saying that you have chosen the safest path, even if that path leads straight to existential emptiness. It is more comfortable to blame circumstances, the economy, family, anything that allows one to avoid the most painful truth, that one has chosen mediocrity. Nietzsche saw this spiritual capitulation as the greatest danger to humanity, not the great historical villains, not natural disasters, but the normalization of mediocrity, the transformation of the extraordinary into the exception and the ordinary into the rule, the creation of a society where being ordinary is considered a virtue and standing out is viewed with suspicion. There is something almost obscene in the way we romanticize our own surrender. At least I'm realistic, I can't complain. It could be worse. Each of these phrases is a small betrayal of the very possibility of greatness. It is the mind creating comforting narratives so as not to have to face the uncomfortable truth that we have chosen the easy path, not the truest one. The test of eternal return is not just philosophical, it is deeply practical. If you had to relive this exact day over and over again, would there be pride or despair? If this week were to repeat itself eternally, would it be a blessing or a curse? If this year had to be lived forever, would it generate gratitude or panic? The answer to these questions reveals much more about the quality of one's existence than any external assessment. Because deep down everyone knows when they are truly living and when they are just passing time. The difference is palpable, visceral. Authentic life has weight, texture, it leaves a mark. Mediocrity is too light. It slips through your fingers without leaving a trace. There is a specific cruelty in realizing that you have wasted entire years living on autopilot, waking up, working, complaining, sleeping, repeating, as if life were an obligation to be fulfilled, not a work to be created. As if existing were enough when what is required is to live with enough intensity to justify the privilege of being here. What Nietzsche proposed was not a philosophy of despair, but of radical responsibility. If every moment were eternal, if every choice had infinite weight, how would one live? What words would be spoken? What risks would be taken? What version of oneself would emerge when eternity was at stake? The question remains suspended in the air, echoing in the deepest layers of consciousness. Does the life one is building deserve eternity? Or is it just an elaborate way of killing time until time kills back? Albert Camus knew something that most people prefer to ignore. There is no ready-made meaning in the world waiting to be discovered. The universe has no hidden purpose, no ultimate reason, no divine plan that justifies existence. And it is precisely in this absence of pre-established meaning that the only real possibility of freedom lies. The revelation is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it removes all existential crutches. There is no destiny, no guarantees, no script to follow. Liberating because it means that each person has the absolute power to create meaning out of nothing, to carve meaning into the rough stone of existence. Camus called this rebellion, not political or social rebellion, but an intimate insurrection against the absurdity of the human condition. It is the refusal to passively accept a life without intensity. It is the radical decision to continue living and creating beauty, even knowing that everything ends, that nothing remains, that the universe is indifferent to our personal dramas. There is a heroic generosity in this stance. It takes extraordinary courage to love knowing that you will lose, to create knowing that everything will be destroyed, to invest emotionally in something that has an expiration date. But Camus understood that this is the only authentic way to exist, to give everything to the present not in spite of finitude, but precisely because of it. True generosity toward the future consists in giving everything to the present, he wrote. This phrase carries a density that only reveals itself when you really stop to feel it. It is not about living irresponsibly or hedonistically. It is about recognizing that the only moment when you are truly alive is this one, now in this second that is already passing as these words are read. The modern tragedy is not the lack of time, it is the inability to fully inhabit the time available. We live constantly in the between what was and what will be, between regret and anxiety, between nostalgia and expectation. The present becomes just a passageway, a corridor between two more important rooms. But the present is the only place where life truly happens. There is something almost revolutionary about deciding to live with such intensity. In a society that functions on the basis of postponements, that sells future happiness in installments, that promises that one day everything will be fine, choosing the fullness of the now is an act of silent rebellion. It is refusing to be just another well-dressed zombie walking toward a future that may never come. But this choice requires a painful renunciation. You have to give up the illusion of control. Accept that tomorrow cannot be guaranteed, that there is no way to completely protect yourself against loss, that every human connection carries with it the possibility of separation. It is a radical vulnerability that most people cannot bear to assume. Camus found in the figure of Sisyphus the perfect metaphor for the human condition. Condemned to push a rock up a mountain for all eternity, knowing that it will always roll back down, Sisyphus represents every person who wakes up every day knowing that they will die, who faces challenges that repeat themselves endlessly, who builds things destined to collapse. Camus' genius was to realize that Sisyphus can be happy, not despite his absurd condition, but precisely because he has accepted it completely. When one stops fighting the inevitable, when one abandons the illusion that there is a final solution to the problem of existence, something extraordinary happens. Energy is free to live with an intensity that previously seemed impossible. Imagine Sisyphus descending the mountain after pushing another rock. Imagine him walking slowly, observing the landscape, feeling the wind on his face, perhaps whistling a tune. These moments between one task and another, this is the space of possible happiness. Not in the final conquest, but in the quality of presence along the way. What if life is exactly that? What if there is no final mountain to conquer? No definitive prize to win? No perfect version of yourself to achieve? What if the only thing that really matters is the quality of your presence in each moment, the intensity with which you choose to exist even though you know that everything is temporary? The answer does not come from outside. There is no guru, book or philosophy that can solve this question for someone else. The answer comes from a solitary encounter with oneself, from the moment when one stops running away from one's own finitude and finally decides to live as if each day was simultaneously the first and the last. Because in the end, when everything is over, and it will be over, it won't matter how many days one has lived, but how alive one was in the days one had. Eternity is not in the time that lasts, but in the depth with which you immerse yourself in the time that remains. And perhaps that is the secret that Sisyphus discovered at the top of the mountain, that the rock was never the problem. The problem was always believing that happiness was at the top when it was always available on the way up. What would you do if you knew your rock would never stop rolling? Write in the comments. If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You watch the videos. You reflect on each idea. Now the question is, how far do you want to go with this? If you want to take the next step and truly apply this knowledge to your life, the codes of the White Rabbit are ready for you. The link is in the pinned comment. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.